And who would have imagined that the statues of all these white supremacists and the slave owners and the slaveholders and slave traders would be brought down and thrown into the rivers and seas?
Sorry, now I need to be myself. Okay, that was good. You have good jokes. You have good jokes. Okay. 3, 2, 1. Good day and welcome to another episode with Unapologetic. Today with me we have Professor Hamid Dabashi. Professor, welcome.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
It's good to have you. Professor Hamid Dabashi is a professor of many things, but for the purposes of this interview, he's written many books. He's written more than 20 books. We're going to regard him as someone who has insights to empire and how it works. Professor, just straight up, you grew up in Iran. You were born 2 years before the CIA coup removed Mossadegh. How do you think that coup and growing up in the Shah's Iran has informed who you are as a person and what you've chosen to do with your life?
Extremely important. Recently, I finished my childhood autobiography, which was informed by a book called Tufula Hozairan, Childhood of June, by a Palestinian friend, Ismail Nashif, who was born right after 67. And it's also something similar to what Salman Rushdie did in Midnight Children. But between 48 and 67, I was born in 1951, namely just 2 years before the CIA MI6 coup against Mossadegh. Now, as I write in my book, my earliest memory is I was being carried by my mother across the street. I was a toddler, and then a military, what we used to call a military common car, with that personnel carrier, was crossing the street and almost hit my mother. And I have this memory of being hit. The next memory is a few years after the military coup of 53, my mother had sent me to buy some groceries. And on my way back, I saw this truck full of thugs screaming on top of their voices, Shahanshah Piruze, Mossadegh Dayuse. The king, the Shah, is victorious. Mossadegh is a pimp. I remember I didn't know what the word dayus, which means pimp, mean in Persian. So I rushed home and I asked my mother, what's dayus? And my mother laughed and said, never mind. And so my earliest childhood memories are obviously informed by military coup of CIA MI6. But it is not until much later that I kind of relived that trauma. I had a very happy childhood, a very productive childhood, loving family. My father worked for the railroad in Ahvaz. My mother was a homemaker. So what caught years later when I moved to the United States and somebody said, why don't you go back where you came from? I always say, I am back where I came from because I came from your coup. You came to me before I came to you. I am the product of the trauma of 1953. And the older I have become, the more conscious I have become of the military coup of 1953. As you know, my country, Iran, is not the only place that U.S. intervention has been crucial. Just a few years after the military coup of 1953, the Egyptian canal crisis happened when Britain and France put Israel to use of invading Egypt. So those of us who were born and raised, whether anywhere from India to Pakistan to Iran to Egypt, North Africa, etc., all our lives are informed by military intervention, military coups d'etats, systematic colonial domination. And the older we get, obviously, those traumatic moments find their way into our scholarship, into our thinking, into our memories, and into how we construct our personal and political life.
Just give us some context on Ahwaz. Just what kind of a town, village it was, how far it was from Tehran.
Yeah, I was a provincial capital of Khuzestan, and it was mostly labor migration, internal labor migration. We had people from all over Iran coming to Ahvaz for work. Oil industry was based in Ahvaz, and also, I mean, the capital was in south in Khorramshahr and Abadan, but the capital of the province was Ahvaz. The same was the railroad that went from Khorramshahr all the way to Tehran. Because of these two industries, railroad and oil, Ahvaz was a provincial capital that attracted labor. But this labor that came from internal labor migrations from around the country also included labor migrations from the region, the Persian Gulf region. I also even remember uh, friends of my father who came from Palestine or from Iraq or from Syria. And as a result, I grew up with a profoundly cosmopolitan culture. I grew up on Arabic music because my father listened to Radio Baghdad or Radio Basra, and had his vodka, smoke, and cooked for us. And that's my most beautiful, lasting memory of Kulthoom's music and Smirnoff vodka and my dad's cooking for us. And the epicenter of labor activism in Ahvaz were actually mosques. The various uh, immigrants who came to Ahvaz, say from Esfahan or from Bushehr or from uh, further up north, the mosque that they formed became the center of their social life, the religious life, the political life. I remember with my father, we used to go to, because he came from Bushehr, southern part on the Persian Gulf. We used to go to his mosque, namely the mosque that labor immigrants from Bushehr had created. And before any religious ceremony or anything that had to do with Shi'i commemoration of the martyrdom of Imam Hussein, they were really talking about union organizations and how to defend their rights and so forth and so on. So that's the environment in which I was born and raised.
Tell us a bit about what it was like living under the Shah. Did you see much of the repression, or was it hidden from you? Was there a sense
Not,
of you
yeah,
living
not
under this?
until
Yep.
not until uh, the uh, the military coup of 1953. I was too young. I was just 2 years old. But the June 63, by which time I was 12 and I was aware of things. June 1963 uprising in Tehran and in Qom. Initially, the initial attempt of Ayatollah Khomeini to topple the Shah became the most potent political event of my teenage years. But still, the event was very much Tehran based and Qom based and religious in its disposition. But because of my female cousins, my dokhtardai, as we say, so the thing about English is you say cousin, you don't know what the gender is. In Persian, magnificent, you know what it is. Dokhtardai is the daughter of my maternal uncle. Because of them and especially their exposure to Persian poetry, I became political not through political parties, but through modern Persian poetry. So by the time of the June 1963 uprising, I was still in Ahvaz. I was a teenager in high school. I was fully aware of the political situation. But also because of the rivalries and competition between the Shah and Hassan al-Bakr, the president of Iraq, and Ahwaz being an epicenter of competition between Iraq and Iran, I mean, the regime of Shah and regime of Hassan al-Bakr, I was also aware of the geopolitics of the region. However, my father, as again I have written in my autobiography, was most of the time an anti-colonial nationalist, uh, pro Mossadegh. But once a month, maybe towards the end of months, when he ran out of his vodka and ran out of his cigarettes, he became an Nasserite socialist, an advocate of Gamal Abdel Nasser. So those, and then we had a mullah, a blind mullah. The role of blind mullahs are very important. My mother was very religious Shia. This blind mullah will come once a month to our home to sing the praises of the Shia saints. But then he will do that 10 minutes or so, and then the rest of it he will get engaged with my father, political discussion with my father, depending on whether my father was in the anti-colonial nationalist mood of 3 weeks a month or Nasserite socialist mood the fourth month. So I grew up with these really dominant political discourses in our household. Anti-colonial nationalism of the sort of Mossadegh, third world socialism of Gamal Abdel Nasser, and militant Islamism of the sort that Khomeini represented and this blind mullah, Mullah Javad, represented in our neighborhood. So this is long before I go to Tehran, but my politicization is when I become an undergraduate student in Tehran.
Okay, so when you become an undergraduate student in Tehran, what do you go study? And what is your reading, your own reading on the political situation in Iran at that moment in time?
Yeah. The thing, I studied economics, and I was interested in political economy. But the curriculum and the syllabus of the universities in Iran were heavily censored and under control of the secret police. Our education was actually in the streets. That's why I've always been fond of Maxim Gorky's My Universities, a book that I read in Persian translation when I was in Tehran. That he paradoxically is called My Universities. He had come to study to go universities, but he never went because he was too poor. So the thing to remember in Tehran, I was in Tehran for about 5 years before we moved to US as an undergraduate student. I was also a labor migrant. I did not come from a rich family. The money I had saved and my mother had saved could not sustain me for more than 6 months. So after that, I had to work. So most of my time during the day was working to make money, to put a roof over my head, and then extremely politically active with the Marxist Fadayan organization, activism, sort of. But then a little time left for my studies. So I was very poorly educated as an undergraduate, uh, in part because of the curriculum of the universities were very much compromised, in part because I had to work, I didn't have time to study. Whatever little education I had to do with book peddlers in the streets. The first day that I arrived in Tehran to go to college, somehow somebody put a list in my hand that the secret police, Savak, had created. On the top of it was written, Liste Kotub Zalle, the list of books that will misguide you. And they had given this list to all the bookstores in Tehran that they should not carry these books or else. Somehow somebody put that list in my hand, and that became, as I
Your
have said
curriculum.
it, it became my core curriculum. And I went down the list. And the list, yes, it included, for example, Brecht or Gorky or things of that sort. But it also included, believe it or not, Shakespeare's Hamlet. Can you guess why Shakespeare's Hamlet? Because
Tell
the
us.
student kills the king. So that was my curriculum, and the sort of books that we bought, in the streets, and the books that were sort of paperback and they were disheveled and they didn't they had come to pieces. To this day, I suspect books that are very nicely bound and are glossy and so forth. I like books that are kind of yeah. So those were between 1971, 1976, these six seminal years, uh, that now the 70s. Michael Hart just wrote a magnificent book on subversive 70s. 70s are being reconceptualized as an extremely important decade. Yeah.
So tell us, I mean, as you learning by yourself and going to university and doing your political activities, was there a sense of subversiveness? Did you kind of feel a sense of
Oh,
fear
absolutely, absolutely,
always? So it was always it was very
yeah.
very you could
First of
taste it in
all,
the
there were
streets, or like what kind
my,
of level
my
of
yeah, my political affinity and solidarity and uh, uh, sort of ideology was with Cherikai Fadayi Khalq, the new Marxist organization that believed in armed struggles. And in 1971, they, on the model of Che Guevara and Castro in Cuba, they wanted to initiate an armed struggle beginning in the northern part of Tehran. Siah Kal incident is definitive to my generation. The uprising was immediately crushed and nothing came out of it, but it became a very important a symbolic event. But not only that, this is the period that we are very much aware of the student uprisings in Europe and United States, the civil rights movement, anti-war movement. We are aware of the anti-colonial movements in North Africa, in Algeria, in Cuba. We are very much aware of Latin American scene. So in a way, we're beginning to be born into a global scene. The anti-colonial struggles in India, particularly the figure of Nehru, was extremely important for my generation. I remember I read a book, Nehru's letters to his daughter, نامه‌های پدری به دخترش, the letters of a father to his daughter, was part of my becoming aware of the anti-colonial struggles around the world. But at the same time, there was a magnificent body of Marxist historiography that was done in then Soviet Union in Russia, and they were being translated into Persian because we had a number of incredibly competent translators by Iranians whose mother tongue was Russian. Their mother was Russian and their father was Iranian. So they knew Persian and Russian extremely well, and they began to translate these Russian sources by leading Russian scholars, like Petrushevsky, for example. And this is what I mean by my education was you could never see any book like this in any curriculum and in Iranian universities. But you will read one translation by Karim Keshavarz of Petrushevsky and other Russian Marxist historians of history of Islam or history of Iran or history of Asia. And this would revolutionize your conception of how the world was run. It is a period that both my political thinking and also my intellectual and academic and scholarly imagination begins to be formed, because I was extremely impressed how these Russian scholars could command Arabic sources, Persian sources, Armenian sources, Latin sources, all of these languages over which we had no control. But at the same time, they were translated into extraordinary, easy, accessible Persian that we could read and learn. Equally important at this period in Tehran of 1970s is my generation's exposure to a number of seminal poets that nobody now remembers unless they are from my generation. These poets are as follows: Mayakovsky, who wrote in Russian, Pablo Neruda, who wrote in Spanish, Faiz Ahmad Faiz, who wrote in Urdu, Nazem Hikmat, who wrote in Turkish, who else? Mahmoud Darwish, who wrote in Arabic, and our own poet Ahmad Shamlu. So there were these 6, 7 poets that were all made accessible to us in Persian. I recently wrote an article, gained in translation, not lost in translation. What, of course, poetry is poetry, and there is very limited that can be expected. But nevertheless, the fact that we had this cosmopolitan conception of, oh, uh, there was seven poets, not six. I will remember the seventh as well. Uh, that whatever we lost in the original, we gained by the fact that we're all put together, inaccessible, Persian to us, and that formed both the poetic and the political disposition of our imagination.
So in '76, you off to the USA. What are you going to study? Why are you going to study that? But also, by then, is there a sense in Tehran that a revolution is on the way, or not really, or is it just continuous subversion and resentment, but not culminating in something that could actually overthrow the Shah?
Yeah, that's an extremely important question, and I have to answer it from my perspective. When I left Tehran in August of 1976, um, I had no hope, no expectation, no way of thinking, oh my God, the whole world is coming to an end. Absolutely not. But if you were to talk to the Islamists, they say, oh yes, the Shah was coming to pieces in their perspective and their imagination, perhaps. But then I have documented the fact that when Ayatollah Khomeini was in Najaf, before he went to Nufl Chateau, when he was in Najaf, he was writing a series of letters to Iranian students in the US and Europe. And I have documented this chapter and verse that he, in 70s, mid 70s, before he moved to Nufl he is telling his followers that he doesn't expect a revolution will happen, that it will be left to the next generation. The same is if you were to talk to other sort of very politically active and sort of believing in armed struggle, that they thought the Shah was falling. But to me and my kind of class and uh, a family background, etc., I didn't think a revolution is about to happen. So I'm coming to United States. I go for family reasons and connections. We go to Philadelphia, and I begin my PhD in sociology at University of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia. So that period for me until the outbreak of the revolution in 77, 78, for about 2 or 3 years, I lead a very isolated and hermetic life. I suddenly became conscious of how illiterate I am, how I wasted my life in Tehran and not learning anything. So I have a book by a leading Marxist historian, Mohammad Reza Fashahi, which is a history of Iran, uh, in the Islamic period. And I was reading it, and on the margin, and now I'm not sort of 19, 20, 21 years old. On the margin, I'm writing, oh, wow, this is amazing. Look, this is such an insightful Marxist perspective, and this and that. I took that book with me to Philadelphia. Now I'm a graduate student, and have started learning German, and I'm reading Weber, and I'm reading Durkheim, and I'm reading all of that. And then for some reason, I had gone to the same book, writing margins on my own margin. Now I'm an arrogant, idiot graduate student who thinks, oh, my, wow, I've come to United States. Ain't that cool? And I begin to mock myself in my late teens and early 20s. This is what happens to you, idiot, when you're born to a third world country and you know nothing but nothing. And look, make a long story short, there is a third layer of marginalia. Now I'm in my 40s, and astonishingly, I found myself actually in political solidarity with that provincial kid in his late teens. Yes, he was an idiot. Yes, he didn't know much, but his political sentiments were absolutely gold standard correct. But I mean, he just didn't know things. He hadn't read things. So yes, the thing is in the period when I'm in Philadelphia and doing my PhD, and after my PhD, I do a postdoc in at Harvard. I'm mostly preoccupied with reading and learning and sort of becoming a scholar, a younger scholar. But this is the time also that the revolution breaks up. The revolution breaks up in 77, between 77 and 79, and I went to Iran 6 months after the revolution. Revolution happened in February 79. I went to Iran in July of 79. And this was a glorious moment. I had not been in Iran for just a year or so. And I was active in the streets, and I was planning to write my doctoral dissertation on the Iranian Revolution, and interviewing, talking, going to campus of Tehran University. Now my own university, Columbia, kind of looks like the campus of Tehran University during the revolution. This is really a glorious moment, and so forth. And then the following the March of that year, we had the first women demonstrations against mandatory hijab in Tehran. So I'm there for about 6 weeks or so. I have to go back, and I go back to Philadelphia. And the November of that year, of course, the hostages were taken, and we were stranded in the U.S. President Carter at the time canceled our student visas, and we were just stranded in the U.S. And that was the end of that era. Soon after that, I received my so-called green card, finished my PhD, went to Harvard for my postdoc, and after that, I began to teach.
Just take us back a bit. While this revolution is unfolding between 77 and 79, obviously, I'm guessing there's a lot of mixed feelings for you as that's happening. Just what is your conception of what you can remember of yourself at the time, of what it's like, and when the revolution actually comes to fruition in about 79, what are your expectations then, and how did those expectations change or get dashed?
First of all, I don't have mixed feeling. I'm 100% pro-revolution. I am for the revolution. I'm happy it is happening. Right now, there is this horrid monarchists who are even don't calling it revolution, calling it a sedition or whatever, or in hindsight, maybe it was not right, etc. Absolute gibberish. Up until the time of the hostage crisis, when the student followers of Khomeini took hold of the American embassy, and we began to realize that there is a profoundly fascistic element in the Islamist component of the revolution, at the expense of the anti-colonial nationalist and third world socialist elements of the revolution. I began to realize, not just only I, people began to realize in general, Ahmad Shamlou and others. And then the execution of a leading Marxist activist, Saeed Sultanpour, in early 80s, we began to realize that this is not our revolution. This is a whole different fascistic element in militant Islamism, which is exclusive to themselves. They don't have a tolerance for anybody else. Soon after that, of course, the period, 444 days, from November of 79 to January 1981, Khomeini used it and his followers to crush all the oppositional figure in alternative camps of anti-colonial nationalists and third world socialists. And before that hostage crisis was even over, September 1980, the Iran-Iraq war started with Saddam Hussein invading Iran. And that war could have ended within a year or two, but Khomeini deliberately extended it because for 8 years he used and abused it in order to crush all opposition. This is the period that mass execution in prisons happen, successive cultural revolutions happen, university purges happen. Between 80 and 88 when he died, and it is capped by the Salman Rushdie incident in 88, 89. Again, just before he died, while the attention of the world was towards Salman Rushdie, fatwa, and the satanic verses, he managed, under the smokescreen of Salman Rushdie incident, to have the constitution revised in a manner that the current leader, Ayatollah Khamenei, could succeed him. So to go back to your question, I had no ambivalent feeling toward the revolution. I was for the revolution. To this day, I believe it was an important event to have happened, and that there was an Islamic republic in the belly of Iranian political culture that had to come out. But at the same time, from day one, from Khomeini came back to Iran in February, from March, women were, 8th of March, the International Women's Day, women were marching against mandatory veiling until this last year, the Mahsa Jina uprising. Again, women have always been at the forefront of these uprising against the Islamist regime. So what am I feeling in Iran, in Philadelphia? First of all, I'm drawn to my work as a graduate student, trying to understand the world in a larger sense. Second, I am obviously agitated that I am not in Tehran. I wish to have been in Tehran. And the first chance that I had before the Iran hostage crisis, I rushed back to go to Iran. Media is not like this, Ashfaq, as you know, is a whole different world. I was stranded with this horrid New York Times gibberish about the events around the world. And then local radio, to this day, when I remember it, I have nightmare, resuming our story about Iran and then some gibberish about Iran. I got into a car and drove to a suburb of Philadelphia to a Radio Shack to find a shortwave radio, for God's sake, to try to get Tehran radio from Philadelphia. So this is a whole different world. My heart is in Iran, but my mind is in my work. And the first chance that I had, I went to Iran, but then came back and the hostage crisis happened. So then eventually what happened, Iran became my scholarship. My scholarship became my homeland, if that makes any
Yep.
sense.
Professor, I just want to stay on Iran for a while. We are going to start speaking about your journey in the USA, and honestly, more like your introduction to white supremacy and how it's impacted your life and what's happening in Gaza now. But just let's stay in Iran for a while, because I think that experience informs all of this. Two questions. The first is in 81, when the hostage crisis begins, did you think that 43 years later, there'd still be an Islamic Republic? That's the other question. And then the second question is, what doesn't the West really get about Iran? Like, I mean, there's clearly a lot by the fact that you just said all the media was gibberish, and I think many people outside of the USA would agree with you. But what just for you, the crux of the matter, what do you think is the crux behind what they just don't understand about Iran?
Let me start with the easy question, which is a fundamental ignorance that this country has, not just about Iran, about anything, about around the world. And that's a predominance of ideologically driven media. There is a tremendous body of scholarship that in universities, colleges, and journals, etc., but has no organic link with the level of public knowledge that exists about anything. And especially when I had come to United States, there, I mean, I remember pomegranate. I saw in Philadelphia, we had something called Italian market, and for the first time, I saw a pomegranate in Italian market. They didn't know what they are. They were. The guy said, "What do you do with them Indian apples?" In the U.S., anything that they don't know, they call it Indian. Anything that is strange is Indian. What do you do with them Indian apple? I said, this is not Indian apple. This is called pomegranate. And pita bread and feta cheese and all sorts of other things. I mean, immigrants in this country have had a civilizing mission of civilizing the palate of these people. In the 1970s, when we had an influx of Korean immigrants, for example, they made this country vegetable and fruit eaters, because every other street corner you had this ghastly, horrid hot dogs. So I always, in defense of immigration, I said before the influx of Korean immigrants, you were all eating hot dogs, ghastly, horrid hot dogs. Now you have become vegetable and fruit eaters. It is because of the Korean migration. They have added thousands of years, millions of years to your lives because of making you fruit and vegetable eaters. So what is it? What am I? What are my thoughts? My thoughts is obviously now my connection to my homeland increasingly becoming thinner. I'm not traveling to Iran anymore. The means of communications were not as fast as possible. My mother passed away during the Iran-Iraq war, and I couldn't go to Iran. There was no possibility of my going to attend to my mother's funeral. So increasingly, as in the same year that my mother passed away, my elder son was born. So I'm becoming more and more rooted in the United States by virtue of my children, by virtue of my work, my scholarship. English becomes my primary language of a scholarship. I began to continue to write in Persian for maybe a decade. But it wouldn't be satisfying because I was not in Tehran and I didn't have an immediate Persian speaking audience. So there is a systematic, gradual transformation of an immigrant like me. I mean, Edward Anand, may he rest in peace, used to have these conversations. I think differently than Edward Said in his magnificent book, Representations of Intellectuals, that he thinks we should all be in exile, that he theorizes the exilic condition as the condition to be, whether factual or metaphoric conceptions of exile. But I don't celebrate the condition of exile. And in fact, I don't consider myself in exile. I'm an Iranian who lives in New York. That's the end of the conversation. And there are thousands of other people like me, come from Pakistan or Iran or Egypt or Mexico, etc. And we all live here in New York, and this is where we live. This is not our homeland. I mean, I have become fanatically more and more connected, and you see it in the body of my scholarship, to find this obscure text that nobody even in Iran knows about, and sort of turn them into the substance of my scholarship. I'm going off tangent, but
Okay,
bring me
yeah, no,
back
yeah.
to
Just to
yeah.
bring you back. So, 43 years later, did you think that the
Yes.
mullahs would still be
No.
in charge of
Yeah,
Iran?
excellent question. No. Never for a moment since the revolution have I ever thought that this thing will last. I've always thought it a temporary sort of stage. And initially, when Khomeini was still alive, you could sense it, especially in some revolutionary thinkers like Talghani or Motahari, uh, or Shariati before Shariati died, that in their language, in their discourse, in their ideological formations, they were dialogical. They were in debate with anti-colonial nationalists. They were in debate with third world socialists. They were not sort of monological. But since the Khomeini died and this belligerent Islamist regime came to power, internally, they became monological. They no longer have an interlocutor. They just talk to themselves. Eventually, they gave birth to something they called religious intellectuals, Roshan Fikr Dini, which became useful to them in order to give them the simulacrum of a theoretical legitimacy, but after a while they couldn't even tolerate them and they were kicked out. So, no, never at any point did I think this Islamist regime will last. And as you see right now, they have sustained themselves in power by becoming a spread in the region in a way that their security and permanence and continuity, if not permanence, is contingent on their involvement in Palestine, in Iraq, in Syria, in Yemen, etc.
You earlier mentioned you kind of disagreed intellectually with Edward Said's idea that you should be in an exilic condition. Don't you think that was very much so because he was Palestinian?
Oh, absolutely, absolutely, of course. I always told him, I understand your country is under occupation, your homeland is under occupation. I have a homeland. I can go back to my homeland. I go to jail if I go to my homeland, but it would be jail in my homeland. No, no, you're absolutely correct. He theorized and celebrated the condition, exilic condition. But my point is, as I wrote in my book on Brown Skin, White Mask, in a loving dialogue with Edward Said, who I loved and admired as a friend and a colleague and a comrade, that the condition of exile does not always generate an Edward Said. It also generates comprador intellectuals like Fuad al-Ajami and many others, that they also become gun for hires because they don't have any rooted connection to anything. So condition of exile is not something for me to be celebrated. But also, my own connection and commitment to Palestine and Palestinian national liberation is, in fact, Palestine has become a simulacrum of a homeland for me because it's a stateless. I'm a stateless person. So I identify with a nation that is a stateless.
Okay, final question on Iran. What do you think? I mean, you said you've always thought that the Iranian theocracy is almost at a demise, right? Do you still think so? And what do you think are the things that threaten it, or why would it unravel?
Right now, the ideological premises of Islamic Republic is theocratic, but right now there is just a state apparatus. It's just the state, the interest of the state that is sustaining itself. They have no hesitation to collaborate and corroborate and work with any force in the region, but they have formed an alliance with the Houthis in Yemen and the Syrians and the Iraqis and the Palestinians, etc., in order to sustain themselves in power. But they also work with the Taliban. They also work with Egyptians. They also work with US. They also work with Europeans. They have lost all their ideological sort of fanaticism, and it is now the sheer force of state interest of the state, that keeps them in power.
Okay, now let's speak about your journey in the USA once you arrive. So it's clear, just from what you mentioned already, that when you arrive in the USA, you have very anti-colonial, anti-imperialist ideas. So I mean, and you still do. So I don't think there's a transformational journey, but definitely there's a journey of you being informed by your environment. So let's go like to maybe the early 80s. What is your thinking been in this journey of 40 years living in the USA, teaching in the USA? How do you think that has changed? Now that you are in empire and existing within empire, and seeing it from inside the beast of the belly, so to speak.
I think it is not until the first Gulf War, the US-led invasion of Iraq, and then the second Gulf War, and then the events of 9/11, that all of this kind of quiet and silent sentiments come to the fore. Much of the 80s, for me, was pursuing my academic goals and academic purposes, just writing and publishing and getting a job and getting a tenure and those sorts of things. Now, if you look at my writings, between in the 80s, is all an attempt to understand what happened in the Iranian Revolution, beginning with my theology of discontent, and in fact, even before that, beginning with my authority in Islam. It is all an attempt to understand the full dimensions of the Iranian Revolution. That's the 80s. So my mind and soul is very much still in Iran, evident in my scholarship. But beginning with the Gulf War, Bush the father, and then the second Gulf War, and then the events of 9/11, and then the US-led invasion of Afghanistan and Iraq, that I became, if you look at the internet, all in the streets. February of 2003, just a month before the US-led invasion of Iraq, I'm out in the streets kicking and screaming against the war. And also the other thing of it is that after the events of 9/11, I was talking to my colleague Mahmoud Mamdani, whose office is just across the hall from me, and he said to me at some point that his mother had told him, "Have you noticed since 9/11 your your Arabic and Islamic expressions have multiplied. We became very much conscious of being Muslims. I remember with Tariq Ali had a conversation. Tariq Ali at some point had written, "Oh yes, I was born a Muslim, but I'm a Marxist and I'm an atheist, and so I stay in line of atheist Muslims." Uh, 9/11 had a transformative event on our character when the little Afghan kids or Iraqi kids or Iranian kids were ashamed of their names, scared of their names, being Ahmad or Muhammad or whatever. And I became more and more conscious of my being a Muslim. And in fact, I wrote a book, Being a Muslim in the World. Uh, so, in terms of the trajectory, going back to your question, in the 80s, I'm very much still trying to understand the Iranian Revolution. But beginning with the 90s and the US flexing its muscles, military muscles, under the Reagan administration, a very important period because up until the Reagan administration, we had something in US political culture called Vietnam syndrome, that they didn't want to engage militarily. President Reagan changed that by massive investment in militarization and also collapse of Soviet Union and what have you, and the rise of US as a monopolar power that became particularly manifest in Bush the father calling it the New World Order. Now, the idea of this empire and what it does and how does it work, especially when it flexes its military muscle in Iraq, and then subsequently under Bush the son in also in Iraq, but also in Afghanistan and so forth, that this particular empire and the way it works and the work of critical thinkers like Hart and Negri in articulation of the empire as not having a center, but having become this global phenomenon, became paramount in my own thinking. And this is when you see the rise of a series of books that I write that for some reason they're mostly with my British publishers, with Zed and Pluto and so forth. And as early as I would say late 90s, I call them Intifada series. I have like 5, 6 books in the Intifada, borrowing the term from Palestinian Intifada. That I'm trying, and they are not kind of a scholarly work. They are activist work. They're Intifada work. They're work that, for example, the Arab Revolution, the Arab Spring happens. I'm trying to understand Arab Spring, or the Green Movement in Iran starts. Or I wrote a book that got angry with Zizek about philosophy. So I wrote Can Non-Europeans Think? Those sorts of writings. They are mostly from the 90s and then forward, books in which I'm trying to understand the nature of this beast in the belly of which I now live.
Okay. I mean, I can recall, and I was when it was very young in the 90s and early 2000s, but a lot of the discussion then about the U.S. invasion of Gulf War One, and then its sanctions on Iraq, and then its reaction to 9/11 in Afghanistan and Iraq. I think to a large extent then, many people were still talking about it. I mean, there was definitely a layer of white supremacy, but they were also talking about it from a realpolitik perspective. There's oil in Iraq, geopolitics, all those kind of things. Have you been surprised when you now look back at it? If you look back to 1991, the Gulf War, which is now more than 3 decades ago, have you been surprised that since the end of the Cold War, so much of the US's foreign policy is actually divorced of realpolitik and ingrained in ideological supremacy?
The answer should be no, I shouldn't be surprised, but I am surprised, particularly since the phenomenon of Donald Trump. I mean, not that Donald Trump was a surprise to me, that white supremacy is wow, there is white supremacy in this country. But it was never so blunt. It was never so in your face. It was never so, proud to be part of the political culture of this. I mean, look at the composition of people in the Congress. Look at the rhetoric of Donald Trump's first attempt at the White House, and now you see it even more adamantly. White supremacy has always been definitive to this political culture and periodically has come back and forth since the civil rights movement of the 60s. You might say that there is a rise of a kind of a liberal imperialism that has those sentiments, but has learned how to camouflage them in liberal terms. New York Times is the best example of it. But since the rise of Trump as a phenomenon, now that is right in the open. That is the fascistic elements in American political culture that goes back to pre-civil rights movement. In fact, goes back all the way to the Civil War. Is now up and visible. Now, what made it palpable, of course, was the Black Lives Matter and the global reflections of Black Lives Matter. Because when the statues of slave owners and slaveholders and Confederate generals began to come down in the US, up until recently, up until the time that I was taking my young children to New York Natural History Museum, you had this ghastly statue of President Roosevelt on a horse with this majestic, arrogant look, and a Native American naked on one side, and an African American naked on the other side, right there and then. It was not until the Black Lives Matter uprisings that people began to write. I was one of them who began to write. I said, what horrid is this? How could people? It is not just the statue; it's the space around the statue that the statue claims. And then, of course, eventually that the statue was taken away and thrown to some garbage, I don't know where. The same phenomenon was happening in UK. At some point, they were going after Churchill's. Churchill, for God's sake. I mean, I am the product of Churchill's racism and horrid racism in the coup of 1953. They didn't even think we are human beings. I mean, in the piece that I just wrote criticizing Habermas, advocacy of genocide of Palestinians, I said, the thing is, in European philosophical imagination, we are not human beings. We don't exist. And this is not something that we didn't know as early or as late as Immanuel Kant's observation concerning the sublime and the beautiful. You see this horrid racism about Africans, about Asians, about Latin Americans, in the very father of European Enlightenment. But the thing about this book, Observations of Sublime and the Beautiful, is pre-critical, is before Immanuel Kant's guards were up in his three critics. And Kant scholars don't want to talk about this particularly nasty, racist elements of Kant, in which at one point he says, so-and-so from Africa says something, I'm quoting almost verbatim, that kind of makes some sense. However, the man who said it is top to toe black, a clear indication that whatever he says is a stupid, end of quote. So this is the very father of European Enlightenment. My point is that it is necessary, but not sufficient to say Kant was racist or Hegel was racist or Habermas is racist, because these are not ad hominem attributions. These are written into the philosophical foregroundings of their thinking. There is a reason that 30,000, 40,000 at least Palestinians are slaughtered. And it's still in Germany, it's still in England, not the people, but the government, the state positions. They just, all you have to do, imagine if this was reversed, if these were Israelis who are being slaughtered, then how the world will come to an end. So we need to go back to the philosophical, moral, or immoral foundations of the European racism transferred here to the United States in order to see why is it that the people, our kind of people, that famine in in Bengal or massacre of Africans in Namibia by Germany, long before the Holocaust, have never really entered the public discourse. And the attempt now to bring it to public discourse, which began much earlier with people like Mossadegh in Africa and on Fanon, continued by people like Mudimbe and others, and continued with Edward Said and Malcolm X, and before Said, Malcolm X, now has come to fruition that you see it on campuses of American and European universities. Yes, Palestine is at the epicenter of this uprising, but it is not just Palestine. This movement is connected to Black Lives Matter, is connected to xenophobia, is connected to homophobia, is connected to all sorts of social malaise that are rooted in an incurable, in my opinion, incurable racism of this political culture. That now you see it suddenly kind of blowing up in their face.
To what extent, I mean, when it comes to the othering of Muslims and Arabs and brown people in particular, to what extent do you think credit needs to go to the Zionist movement and the Israel lobby? Or do you think it's primarily, what's the relationship here? Is it primarily driven by white supremacy? I mean, I think that is true, but to what extent has the Zionist movement sort of played into that trope?
Well, listen, Palestine has been a gushing wound since Nakba for people around the world, not just Palestinians, not just Arabs, not just Muslims. Palestinians are not Muslims. Not all Arabs are Muslims. So that gushing wound, the fact that, as Ilan Pappé, the distinguished Israeli historian, calls it incremental genocide. The genocide didn't start October 7. This incremental genocide has always been a gushing wound. So what has happened, liberal Zionism has managed to weave itself into a kind of a faux liberalism and open-mindedness in the absence of the moment that Edward Said called permission to narrate. The moment Palestinians are allowed to narrate, and it is not just a question of narrative, it's the question of persistence of Palestinian question, the credit for which goes to Palestinian people. And then, of course, there are intellectuals like Said, like Mas'ad, like Azmi Bishara, like other Arab critical thinkers and non-Arab critical thinkers. Iqbal Ahmad, the Pakistani intellectual, was chiefly responsible for politicization of Edward Said. Edward Said was a professor of English, and it is his friendship with Iqbal Ahmad, may he rest in peace, an amazing revolutionary thinker, and Ibrahim Abu-Lughod, that he became political. So yes, your point is correct that Zionism had crafted this cozy corner for itself. It was democracy in that cool, that it was a villa in the jungle, as one of them put it. It was Western civilization. Of course, it's a Western civilization, meaning barbarism at the root of Western civilization. And especially in the United States, it had infiltrated civil rights movement. So they always thought that civil rights movement was integral to it. There is also something that now is beginning to be cured or addressed, which is African-American Zionism, that is was part of the early Africanist, African-American idea of liberation. They were looking up to Israel. Those things are now melting, and they're melting by virtue of the consistent work that the generation of Edward Said, not just Edward Said, have done. And right now, what you see, there is a reason why this event blew up at Columbia University. Is the specter of Edward Said, is the ghost of Edward Said coming back to haunt this campus. But again, I don't want to fetishize Edward Said. He was extremely important, but it is not just his. And it is also a moment that the fundamental and irredeemable racism, white supremacy, and self-entitlement, definitive to this culture, from transatlantic slave trade to Native American slaughter that goes back to 16th century, the writing of Bartolomé de las Casas' account of it. is all coming and coagulating. The Palestinian situation, the Palestinian crisis, the Palestinian cause has been the catalyst that has brought all of these forces together.
Earlier on, you kind of, when we were speaking about Iran, you looked into the distance and you said very fondly that this moment at Columbia is glorious. Can you just expand on that? And just what have you been your thoughts about the protests and also obviously the reaction to the protests from various groups?
Okay. There are two sorts of ways of looking at it. One is the longue durée. We have to start with the fact, and I'm telling you for the first time, that the attempt at divestment began back in 2002, a year before Edward Said passed away. We formed a committee of 6 or 7 people, of which Edward Said has passed away. Edward Said, me, and 5 others. But I'm not going to name those 5 others because they're still alive and kicking and happy and productive and critical and I don't want to create trouble for them. The 7 of us created something we called FCOP, Faculty Committee on Palestine. And we drafted a text in which we were asking our university to divest from companies that are selling arms to Israel. That's all we were asking. And we were going around our colleagues asking them to sign this draft for us to submit it to our Senate. Through Senate, we'll go to the faculty or to the Committee on Responsible Investment to ask for this particular. We could not collect 100 signatures. But nevertheless, we submitted it to our Senate, and we were resoundingly defeated by our opposition. There was a militant rabbi here, Rabbi Chuck Shear, who mobilized against us, and there were hundreds of signatures. However, the key to it is those who were opposing us back in 2002, there was no BDS, I mind you. BDS began in 2005. This was 2002. Most of the signatures against us and for continued involvement and investment in Israel came from medical school, law school, business school, journalism school, professional schools. Whereas our source of signature came from social sciences and humanities. And before you know it, this list of those who had signed, Columbia professors who had signed, asking for divestment became the real critical core curriculum of Columbia University, which professors not to miss if you go to Columbia. And if you look at the book that one of these horrid Zionists wrote against us, 101 most dangerous professors, I don't know if you have seen it, David Horowitz, and all of us, or most of us, 6 of Columbia professors are in that list. And many of these lists, Cheney created a list like that, and then Daniel Pipes created a list of that, and sort of demonizing us and targeting us. So there are specific, the point going back to your question, there are specific histories of Columbia. Then the year after that, 2003, I organized the first Palestinian film festival. Nobody heard of a Palestinian film festival. Edward Said gave the opening remarks, and we had a week of celebration of Palestinian cinema, and on and on. So there is a history at Columbia that at some point it will have to be written that culminated in the events of April 17, when our president was being interrogated in the Congress. And the genius of our students was that they timed it exactly with that appearance in front of the Congress, that as our president was being questioned about anti-Semitism and this and that, our students were occupying the campus. And because the media attention was on President Shafiq, they immediately came to this encampment, and it just exploded. And then, of course, there is a more general context, which is right now Hamilton Hall, which they renamed Hind Hall after a 6-year-old Palestinian girl who was killed by Israelis. The occupation of Hamilton Hall has a whole history, goes back to 68. But in my own way of thinking, I think we need a more global conception of a student uprisings, not just an American. You had European in France, for example, in 68. Egypt has a sustained course of student uprising in Iran, in Turkey, in Pakistan, in India. We need to have a more global perspective. So now, as I speak, of course, we are facing a crisis. I mean, right now, we have to wrap up the semester. Our commencement has been canceled, etc. But a talisman has been broken. The critical dimension of this event that has radically altered the discourse, that has put the university on the defensive, that has enabled a public conversation about Zionism, about investment of the universities in genocide, about transparency of university investments, etc., etc. Its dimensions are far more critical than just the Palestinian cause. This is the reason why, if you look closer at the composition of the students who are engaged, for the first and most important aspect, which makes a mockery of the notion of anti-Semitism, is the presence of our Jewish students, our Jewish colleagues, who are at the forefront of these uprisings. But demographically, it's very difficult to pinpoint who is this. You have African Americans, you have Asian Americans, you have Latino Americans, you have gays, you have lesbians, you have all sort of forms of discrimination and marginalization and demonization that have happened in this country, have their presence in university campuses, and they are part of this moment. The moment is exceedingly important. I think is a transformative period. I think the rest of American history from now on would be, we are going through a radical epistemic shift. It has epistemic violence in it, but it is disruptive. Our students have to sort of graduate, they have to enter the job market. We have professional responsibilities. We're doing our best to meet those professional responsibilities. But at the same time, if you pull back and look at it from a perspective of American history, of world history, I think something absolutely extraordinary is happening as we speak.
Have you been surprised by the brutality that the way the student protests have been met? And I don't just mean by the police. I mean by the brutality of the media and by the presidential statements and by the way there's been a very clear way to sort of delegitimize these protests.
I'm not surprised, but I think it's futile. I mean, right now, New York Times is so exposed. Right now, as you know, in Israel, they banned Al Jazeera. I said not only New York Times should not be banned, and BBC, by the way, which is even equally horrid, BBC and New York Times should not be banned, but should actually be studied in schools of journalism around the world, or how propaganda and yellow journalism is done. New York Times has had one single mission: to discredit this student uprising right under its nose on Columbia campus in Manhattan. Has one mission: discredit it, call it anti-Semitic, outside influences, this and that, one article after another, one opinion piece after another. But it is the more adamantly they oppose it, the more legitimate it becomes. New York Times is so out of touch with reality. It is just a provincial thing, and they don't know how provincial they are. These students are far more connected, far more wired. It doesn't mean they don't make strategic mistakes. So I'm very close to it. I'm 100% supported, but they also make strategic mistakes. But the strategic mistakes that they will correct it. It is a living, organic, magnificent movement. It has American dimensions, European dimensions, global dimensions. The only reason that universities in the Arab world and Islamic world have not joined them because they are under severe censorship. Otherwise, they would have joined them. So, yes, I am not surprised by the violence that the media and the police, etc., are perpetrating, or by the exposure of the liberal hand that they were sort of appearing to be nice and gentle and kind and accommodating and this and that. And then twice in the matter of 10 days, the New York police department is invited to come to our campus, and the task of safeguarding the idea of the university and the sanctity of the body of a student. A student's body is should not be touched, let alone handcuffed. And what for? What they have said? What have they said? They're opposed to genocide. Is that something to be arrested or reprimanded or the police to be called? The more adamantly they oppose it, the more significant it becomes, the more they show their hand that their liberalism and open-mindedness is fake, and the more legitimate this uprising becomes. It has made and will continue to make strategic mistakes, but in my opinion, it will correct itself as it moves forward.
Okay, so the next question is about the juxtaposition of calling out empire while being in the seat of empire. But I mean, before you get there, I just want to kind of draw the attention to you're literally almost at the epicenter right now of calling out empire by being in Colombia. And I mean, it's just a juxtaposition of so many things, because you and many other prominent scholars who have had a role in influencing or creating an environment where these thoughts occur what's the irony here that yourself, Edward Said, Mahmoud Mamdani, Rashid Khalidi, so many other great scholars who are pro-Palestinian, anti-colonial, anti-imperial, have been allowed to fester, so to speak, in the heart of the Upper West Side in New York.
It's not an irony. We are in Rome. This is the Rome of this empire. And we have all come from the peripheries of this empire to the heart of this empire. And it is not that they are tolerating us. The liberalism, they want to flaunt the liberalism. But the fact is that Edward Said's office was bombed on our campus. The fact is that people like me and Joseph Mas'ad and Rashid Khalidi and Mahmoud Mamdani, we are systematically demonized. Right now, the Congress is investigating us for everything that we have said. So it is not that it's easy, right, and we are celebrated. We are not. We are systematically, consistently censored, demonized, marginalized, mocked, turned into three-headed monsters that devour their own children. So it is not easy. But it is also, the fact is that it is possible. Okay, right now, I always say, if I were in Tehran or in Cairo, I will be in jail, right? But they put you in a different kind of jail here. They demonize you. They turn you into a monster. So the range, nobody could be more eloquent than Edward Said in making a case. He was demonized. He was called a professor of terror. His office was bombed, et cetera, et cetera. So it is not an easy being, and I don't think it is paradoxical, is the nature of empires that always in the bosom of the empire, there are all sorts of possibilities to accommodate these strange figures who come, as Edward used to say, if you're Edward, what is Said? If you're Said, what's Edward? And it is not just us, the Latin Americans are here, African scholars are here, Asians, etc., etc. It is a level of an easy tolerance, but it is an easy tolerance that also they make sure that you're limited, that you're always looking over your shoulder, that you're always worried about your next, because we don't have any source of income. We live paycheck by paycheck. We live on Columbia housing, which is subsidized housing. We don't have any source of other income, which is exactly how it should be. Scholars should not be living a very comfortable life. We should be exactly where we are. But precisely because of that, because we don't have any connection, because we don't have any source of support of anywhere, they're scared of what we say. Because what we say is not targeted against any particular atrocity, but it is targeted against atrocities that are representative of a global a condition. Uh, 300, I'm sorry, 850 million human beings go to bed hungry around the world. This is the reality. 320 million human beings roam around the globe in search of a decent living. Ice caps are melting. Labor and refugee migrations into in borders of U.S. and Mexico or in the Mediterranean Sea. These are the global conditions against which critical judgment is emerging. Today, Palestine is the epicenter of this because of the enormity, the vulgarity of the way that it is not just Israel. Israel is doing it on behalf of the West. It is the British that are doing it. It is the Germans who are doing it. It's the French who are doing it. It's the Americans who are doing it. Not just Israel. Israel is doing it on their behalf. So, is it paradoxical? No. This is the way that all empires, especially at the moment of their fragility, work. We are at the epicenter of Rome. This is where Rome is, and they allow us. I mean, they allow us. There is a sort of a liberal condition that we are supposed to be welcomed here, and in a way, I'm sitting in my office. I have a salary, right? I provide for my family. I'm relatively safe unless I do something. The police will not come and break into my office. These are true, and most probably this will not be given to me if I were to say these things as I say in Tehran. But the power of what we say is because it is global and universal. We don't. If I write an article critical of Israel, I've written books critical of Iran. There is no goddamn country on planet Earth of which I'm not critical. Just name it. I have 3 articles against that country. This is the power of persuasion. This is the power of our presence here. That, again, we owe it to people like Iqbal Ahmad. We owe it to people like Edward Said, who enabled and gave us a language. Iqbal Ahmad was a professor at Skidmore College when the Algerian Revolution happened. He just drops everything and goes to Algeria to see what he can do for the Algerians. What has to do with anything? And then he became committed to the Palestinian cause. 2 years ago, I was saying the same things about the uprising in Iran. 10 years ago, I was saying the same things about Egypt. So there is no way of cornering us that we're just, focusing on Israel. It's just ludicrous. Or United States. There is a critical judgment that has been unleashed by virtue of a sustained course of critical thinking that begins in the middle of the 19th century and comes forward. And we are just part of that critical, and after us will continue to be as effective, as eloquent, as persuasive, and as able to talk to generations who care about this issue.
You were a very good and close confidant and friend of Edward Said. What do you think Edward Said would have to say now about Israel's future, given its grotesque reaction to what happened on October 7th and everything that's going on, all the discussions around that currently?
Well, it's both easy to answer and not so easy. Obviously, he would be front and center in any of the critical thinking that happens. He would be furious about New York Times. He would be furious about news coverage. All you have to do is to read his book covering Islam to see how he would react. But he will also see it obviously as a vindication of his thinking and his writing. Right now, I'm thinking of a phrase in what we know it as the last interview, when he was battling cancer and he was weak and chemotherapy and all of that, and in which he says that there are times that I feel tired, but all I have to do is just remember the face of Ariel Sharon. This is the time of Ariel Sharon as the prime minister of Israel, and I get up, or Netanyahu for that matter. He would be happy, quote unquote, by the vindications of his lifetime achievement, particularly around the question of Palestine. He would be horrified by what is happening in Gaza and the rest of Palestine. He would be furious with the way that the press is, especially New York Times and BBC, are covering this. And but at the same time, equally satisfied, I would say, that his work now has blossomed, not only in the new generation of critical thinkers that have appeared after him, and then they are not. The thing is that when they attack universities and take university professors to the Congress and admonish them, and the president say, "Oh yes, we're going to talk to these people," is just entirely gibberish, because the discourse has changed at the fundamental level, classroom level, scholarship level. Books, articles have changed. The way a new generation of historians have emerged, the way they think and they write has changed. So there is no way to control this. So Said would be equally happy to see that his way of thinking has become so not only global but also manifest in the streets. Just before his passing, Gayatri Spivak and I, put together a conference, Subaltern Studies at Large, in which Edward gave the keynote. There are relations of what is happening in what in South Asia we call subaltern studies with Ranajit Guha and others, that this is a world that has been repressed and denied and denigrated and dismissed, now is finding a language to speak. Goes back to Edward's famous essay, Permission to Narrate. We no longer need permission to narrate. We have started to narrating. As one of our students in a sign said, why did you ask me to read Edward Said? I assigned Edward Said. Why did you ask me Edward Said if I'm not supposed to do what I'm doing? So it is, as I said, not just an epistemic shift that the question of Palestine has come to the front and center of our national and global consciousness, but it has been woven into the rest of the issues around us, from the environment to migration to xenophobia, but also has, from a moment of potentiality, has become actual. This is the critical issue.
How far away do you think we are from seeing Palestinian liberation? And I mean, I say that I know that there's a lot of, in the narrative world, there's been a lot of positive things happening for Palestine. But I mean, the reality is that 70% of the homes in Gaza have been destroyed or unlivable. Many people have been killed. Israel are relenting in the sense that they have not shown any signs that they will leave Gaza. They still probably are trying as much as they can to ethnically cleanse Gaza. So given that entire reality in the narrative world and in the facts on the ground, the horrid facts on the ground, how far do you think we are away from that?
It's difficult to say, obviously. Right now, our paramount concern is the continuing genocide. I mean, right now, yesterday, Rafah invasion has happened. Is the continuing genocide, and for us to understand the full measure of this horror as it is unfolding. But the harsher and more evident and more violent this particular phase of the incremental genocide in Palestine by Zionism, the more an indication that Zionism has lost a shred of credibility, if it ever had a shred of credibility. So it is a matter of time. I mean, and it's not just Palestinians. Look at the statement by South Africa against Israel in the International Court of Justice. Has nothing to do with anything. It has to do with legality. Look at the statement of the Special Rapporteur of the UN about the genocide in Palestine. So it is a matter of global understanding and global consensus. And the only thing that they have to shut people up is anti-Semitism. Yes, there is anti-Semitism. Europe it's the hotbed of anti-Semitism, and United States, but has nothing to do with the Palestinian national liberation. Now, what is the ultimate what is the end game? The end game is something that Edward Said and others have said it forever. Right now, the phrase "from river to the sea" has become this this demonic thing but has nothing to do. First of all, it was the Zionists who came up with that phrase, from the river to the sea. They want the entirety of Palestine for themselves. Second, the Palestinians were using it as a rhetorical retort against the Zionist use of them when they say river to the sea. But there is a third way of reading from the river to the sea, which is one state solution. Namely, you have 7 million Israelis, you have 6-7 million Palestinians, enough land for all of them, as a binational state that Edward Said and many others have written on that. That's the solution. There is no other solution. There is no way to play, as somebody even in Europe said, where do you want this 1.2 million Palestinians in Gaza to go? To go to the moon? They will not go anywhere. For every Palestinians that they killed, 5 more Palestinians will be replaced soon. Israelis face, Israel has always had this garrison state mentality that is sort of sitting there. And there is one has to completely lose hope that change in political culture, either in Europe or in US. Because in US and in Europe, Israel is their manifestation, is their representative. How long this will sustain itself? First of all, the actual narrative, the actual story, the actual uttering of the particularities of the Palestinian cause are not a matter of global language. Has nothing to do with Arabs or Muslims or anything like that. But it is a matter of time that whether this 7 million Israelis can continue to live inside this enclosed settler colony. What sort of a life is that? So collapse of that settler colonial imagination, collapse of that garrison state has already effectively, morally, imaginatively, politically happened. But it is just a belligerent. It's just like guarding yourself inside a citadel and start shooting at people. That's not a life. And then whether or not you will have a seismic change in the United States, in the political apparatus, remains to be seen. But the fact that right now on university campuses, which is a seismic element in what is happening in a political culture, university presidents have to come out either to agree to sit down and talk about divestment from Israel or adamantly say, no, we will not divest from Israel. Either way, the question of portfolios of universities, the question of involvement of universities in acts of genocidal violence is a public discourse. And there is also a limit to what degree media in the United States or in Europe can camouflage this and control it or try to muddy the water to demonize these kids. And I mean, these kids, I don't mean any disrespect. They are the moral consciousness of this generation. And they will not be silenced. They will unfold. It will, to me, the issue is not when this movement will succeed, but to what degree it will sustain itself, and the energy, conviction, and purpose with which they are now in the streets and campuses and so forth. That's the sign of hope. It is rooted theoretically and philosophically and morally and imaginatively in generations of scholarship. Not just by Palestinians, by people around the world. Many of them actually Israelis like Ilan Pappé, like Avi Shlaim. So another important issue is Judaism is being liberated from Zionism. This is the issue, that Jewish people are returning to the bosom of humanity as part of humanity, leading this cause. And to me, that's the sign of hope. That's the most significant achievement, not whether or not Israel will collapse and we have a one-state solution, which is something that is staring the world in the eye and sooner or later will happen. But actually this synergy is no longer limited to the Palestinian cause, has a more global consequence. But right now, the epicenter of it is Palestine.
Professor Hamid Dabashi, final question. You mentioned that Jews are saving Judaism from Zionism. Who's going to liberate the world from white supremacy?
Precisely the same movement. Precisely the same movement. But that's a far more difficult task. 70 or 80 million eligible voters in the United States voted for Donald Trump. Not all of them are white supremacists and racist. There are fundamental.
I mean, a lot of white supremacists are voting for Biden, and I mean, so
absolutely,
so
absolutely.
Yeah.
So it is a disease. They have all sorts of conspiracy theories. The great grand replacement, that brown people and black people and Jewish people, by the way, they are extremely anti-Semitic. We are replacing the white people. But at the same time, there is a sustained body of scholarship that white is not a color. White is an ideology. And that in of itself is theoretically and imaginatively is crucial to dismantle the idea of white supremacy. But there are various strong white supremacist elements within the United States. They have just put their white hood somewhere else and in their closet, and they're coming out. And that is an extremely difficult battle. However, the only way to battle it is in the streets, in classrooms, in lecture halls, in conversations, in lectures, in public domain. We need to claim the public domain. Who would have imagined that the statues of all these white supremacists and slave owners and slave holders and slave traders would be brought down and thrown into the rivers and seas? Who would have ever imagined? I mean, as early as 2-3 years ago, right here in New York. But they have been brought down, and this will continue. Confederate flag. I never forget that picture of a young African-American woman climbing a flagpole and going and bringing down the Confederate flag. It has come down. And yes, there are Nikki Haley's and Donald Trump's and all of them there, but they're increasingly on the defensive. I, at this stage, am extremely hopeful and optimistic and even sanguine about what is happening. Because I think the next generation, my children's generation, they will build on, right now, high school, where was it? In Boston, high school children just joined the movement. So it is an adamant element because it's out of fear, not out of conviction, out of fear and illiteracy and the containment of the public sphere. The reason for conspiracy theories always is the absence of civic discourse that translates into conspiracy theories. And the way to dismantle conspiracy theories is just put them out in the sun and they will disappear.
Professor Hamid Dabashi, thank you so much for your time. It's been a very good conversation.
My pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Thank you.